All right, hey everybody, I'll give it just a second, let everybody get brought in from the waiting room. Okay, well, hey everybody, thank you for coming on the meeting. Again, I think most of you on here probably know that I'm Don Armstrong, Director of Student Media, and I want to welcome you to this October-themed Media Monday. And joining us tonight is Dr. Elizabeth Outka. She's a professor of English at the University of Richmond. She has her BA from Yale and PhD from the University of Virginia. And her research focuses on late 19th and early 20th century literature and culture. And her latest book, Viral Modernism, The Influenza Pandemic in Interior Literature, investigates how one of the deadliest plagues in history, the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, silently reshaped the modernist era, infusing everything from Eliot's The Wasteland to the emergence of viral zombies to the popularity of seances. She's the recipient of numerous awards and grants, including a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Outka, for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Don. It's great to be here.
Could you kind of just start off by just kind of giving us an overview of your work? I mean, kind of what led you to this work, and just kind of tell us some about how it's gone and some of the research, and I'll shut up for a second.
No, that's great, and welcome everyone. I think so hey to Quinn and Abigail, Priscilla, Chase, Logan, Caden. Thank you for coming. It's a lot, you know. We're all having these very long days, and I know students are as well, professors are, and so it's great to see everyone here. The book that this conversation is kind of based on came out of a mystery. Really, I'm a specialist in late 19th, early 20th century literature and World War I, and I had spent a lot of years studying that period. And one of the things that comes up a lot in this period is the war, right? World War I, which kills about 10 million people. And it's the worst war that people had seen up until that moment. And a lot of the scholarship of the era is focused on that. So then I started to hear about the influenza pandemic, and this is pre-COVID, right? And we've all probably had influenza, had the flu shot, and the more I learned about it, the first thing I learned was that 50 to 100 million people die in the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. And I thought, okay, how is it possible that something that killed that many people, right, 10 times as many as the war, the US loses more in the influenza pandemic than we lost in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq combined. So where did it go? Like, that's how my research started. Is you can't kill 100 million people worldwide and not have it show up in the art. I mean, art is one of the ways, visual art, literary art, it's how we process huge traumas. And so I knew it had to end up in the art. And so the book really started as me trying to answer that question: why do we not talk about it, and where did it go? And I ended up finding it in everything from literature to popular cultures to zombies to spiritualism. It ends up showing up everywhere. That's the brief thumbnail of it.
And and everyone, I should have mentioned, we'll of course have time. This is a conversation. We'll have time for question and answer. You can just jump in and ask one. If you want to put it in the chat, that works as well. So let me just ask, I'm guessing you were doing this well before we were even in this current pandemic. I mean,
Yes.
So what did you think whenever, 2020 came around and we're, still in this, seems like perpetual pandemic. And so, I mean, how did that influence your work? I mean, what kind of thoughts did you have?
Yeah, I mean, the book came out in October of 2019. So its copyright is 2020, but it came out just as the COVID virus was starting to circulate. But we hadn't really heard about it yet. And so the book doesn't touch on COVID at all. So for me, it was just, and one of the things I say at the end of the book is that like all scientists say, right, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when the next big pandemic would come. But to see it start to unfold was like waking up in a B movie or something, right? It just like suddenly your research comes to life, but not in any way that you would have wished or wanted. So it was uncanny and strange. I did find that all of the literature of this earlier pandemic that I had read, in addition to some of the literature that I teach about AIDS, HIV pandemic, was very helpful and almost comforting, right? To see that that other sort of cultures had navigated these sorts of things, and I found that it was spot on, right? The literature was spot on for it's clearly a different pandemic in a different moment, but a lot of the feelings and emotions were the same. Literature is really great at telling an emotional history and a sensory history, and a lot of what we're experiencing in the pandemic right now is we're going to remember it the way it felt in our bodies, right? And the way it smelled and the way that it tasted and the way that we heard, like what we heard. And in the same way, a scent can bring back a whole flood of memories. I think even hand sanitizer in 20 years is gonna bring us back, right, to this moment. So it was, in some ways, I felt like for myself and hopefully for other people, it was a sort of useful roadmap for all of the jolts and it was a roadmap. It was helpful, even if it wasn't a cure. We need ways to process these huge things.
And I wanted to ask, I know that for a time, I mean, zombies in pop culture was just kind of through the roof as far as popularity goes. I mean, there were books, movies just coming out seemingly constantly, and they're still up there, but it seems like it is like waned just a touch as far as. But I wanted to add one of the ones that I'm one of the few who still watches is The Walking Dead, which has been with us for 11 seasons now, and they're in the last one. But I wanted to ask you, could you talk about some of the specific instances in pop culture that you took a look at that helped kind of show the connection that you were, as far as like from the 1918 pandemic?
Right. Yeah. No, the zombies.
I don't know if I asked that very well, but
no. I get that. No, you did. It was good. So I think that, let me just say a word about sort of monsters in general. Right. We have these sort of monsters in horror, and they're often in cultures, and all cultures have sort of different versions of monsters and horror. And they often reflect the things that we're scared of, right? Or the things that we're anxious about, or prejudices, deep-seated prejudices, or mysteries that we can't explain, or traumas that haven't been processed, right? That these monsters represent different things, right? For different cultures, they can help explain things to us. And zombies are no different, right? Zombies have a very complicated history, and they are, and the meaning of monsters change over time, and the meanings of zombies have changed over time. So sort of every decade needs its own zombie, and so what they mean is not the same in different at different times and for different groups. So and there's a bunch of different strains of zombie. I mean, if you know anything about zombies, right? There's a whole, and I am not a zombie expert, right? Like I'm sort of I'm an English professor, so a lot of you may know a lot more about zombies than I do. I know this particular strain. So there is a strain, though. The term zombie comes is a term that originates, well, yeah, it's a complicated history, so I'm going to be simplifying a little bit. But there is the term itself, zombie, comes at least most recently from a Haitian tradition, and some Haitian religious traditions, and concerned a sort of the dead that had been sort of dug up by a controlling figure and forced then to do labor. And there's a lot of ways that this figure became a kind of trope of slavery and enslavement. And in this sort of tradition, the zombie figure was usually quite docile. And under the control of a living figure, and like I said, there's all sorts of tropes of slavery that are being sort of mapped onto this. And so there's a whole tradition of zombies that come out of this tradition, right? And there's a lot of movies in the 1930s that come out of this tradition. The term zombie in Britain and in the United States, the term zombie is introduced by this really hideous 1929 book called The Magic Island, which is by a guy named William Seabrook. And he goes to Haiti. He's white. He is a World War I survivor, and he goes to Haiti and he records all of these traditions. And he often writes in extremely racist terms, right, about the traditions he observes, and he records the idea of zombies in his book, and that's how the term gets introduced. He doesn't invent the term; it's how the term gets introduced in the United States. So that's one whole zombie tradition that I am not that is not connected to the influenza pandemic. So the one that I am tracing is earlier. It emerges in the 1920s. It is not, they're not called zombies, but they act like they show up in movies and short stories. And these are zombies that eat flesh. They're extremely bloody, and they're not in control of under anyone's control. And they are the living dead, right? They come and they infect other people, a kind of viral zombie tradition. And so I saw these figures emerge in the 1920s. And mainly what I talk about in the book is H.P. Lovecraft, who is a horror writer in the 1920s. And later, and he was the so he writes horror, and he lives through the influenza pandemic in Rhode Island, and he sees all of the horrors of it, and those horrors get sort of wrapped into his short stories, and sort of get mapped onto the short stories. There may be some Lovecraft fans in the audience. I'm confess I'm not a fan. He's a lot of one of the things that he does is start to map zombies and infection onto any of the groups that he hates, right? And he hates a lot of groups, right? So he's quite racist, he's quite homophobic, and so basically we see him sort of transfer his own prejudices into this zombie tradition. But and there's other things that zombie tradition is doing, but and I can talk in specifically about some of the short stories that he writes, and we can look at some passages, you know, from his work. But yeah, so the zombies, that zombie tradition was in some ways a way to, I mean, the influenza pandemic meant that there were bodies everywhere, right? You have 100 million bodies, and there's no funerals because they can't, I mean, there's funerals, but then after a while they can't have funerals because of contagion and because there's too many people to bury, right? They run out of coffins. The grave diggers are exhausted, right? Doctors spread the flu from house to house to house, right? Because it's contagious, but there's no visible enemy, right? It's just this invisible enemy that leaves. This wasn't an ordinary flu, right? It caused these massive floods of bleeding from the ears and the nose and the mouth, right? So it's incredibly bloody, and they don't have any, the sort of mourning rituals can't be followed, right? So you have a whole populace that's really haunted by this idea that their loved one wasn't buried properly, and had a very difficult, right, a bloody end, right? So it's some ways not surprising that we would have monsters that would appear that would be kind of contagious, as it were, right, and spread mayhem. But one of the advantages of a zombie figure is it can be killed. And so Lovecraft imagined these sort of zombie figures who, this sort of terrifying kind of embodied contagion that was then sort of contained, or often contained, and sort of locked away. And it was something you couldn't do with the influenza virus, but that you could really, that you could do if you imagined it as a monster and you could visualize it, and you sort of knew what to do. Yeah, and there's other, you know, and I can elaborate on any of that anyone's interested in.
I have plenty. I just wanted to see if anyone else wanted to jump in with that. Of course, I have other questions, but I would like to hear a little bit more about some of the short stories that you mentioned, as far as.
Yep.
Now, were these and were these also written by Lovecraft, or were these
Yeah.
by different individuals, or?
Yes. So in the book, I analyze a very famous war movie, J'accuse. It's a French war movie that has zombie figures that seem to arise out of the war and the influenza pandemic. But the Lovecraft stories I talk about, one of the central ones is, and here, let me see if I can. Just one thing. All right. So let me see if I can share a screen so I could just get a few visuals up here. All right, so here's the man himself, H.P. Lovecraft, and he wrote one of the big stories I talk about is a story called Herbert West Reanimator, and this is about a doctor figure, and his sort of narrative. The narrator is his sort of sidekick, and they're both medical school students, and and Herbert West is this doctor who decides he can reanimate the dead, right? That he can apply some sort of like chemical concoction and raise the dead, but he needs really fresh bodies. And so what happens is that there is a pandemic that looks very much like the influenza pandemic, and you may recognize some of the scenes here. right? So this is the narrator speaking. I shall never forget that hideous summer 16 years ago, when like a noxious affright from the halls of Eblis, typhoid stalked leeringly through Arkham. And this is where they were. This is a fictional town, roughly equivalent to a town in Rhode Island. It is by that satanic scourge that most recall the year, for truly terror brooded with bat wings over the piles of coffins in the tombs of Christchurch Cemetery. The scourge, grinning and lethal from the nightmare caverns of Tartarus, broke with full demonic fury upon the town. Though not yet licensed as physicians, we now had our degrees and were pressed frantically into public service as the number of the stricken grew. The situation was almost past management, and death ensued too frequently for the local undertakers fully to handle. Burials without embalming were made in rapid succession, and even the Christchurch Cemetery receiving tomb was crammed with coffins of the unembalmed dead. We were frightfully overworked, and the terrific mental and nervous strain made my friend brood morbidly. So this is a quotation here from a letter from a gravedigger in Rhode Island who was working at a graveyard about 17 miles from where Lovecraft was living at the time, describing very similar scene, right? People died so fast, there was barely time to bury them. So they were buried at all hours of the day and night without even having services for them. All right, so this is the kind of, and let me see, what is, all right, so this is the kind of atmosphere, right, that that Lovecraft has around him. And so in this story, what happens is that they look upon this pandemic, right, as something that will allow them to get these fresh dead bodies in order to experiment on them. So they get the one of the head doctors of the hospital. He dies of this. This is in the short story, it's typhoid, but it really maps very much onto the influenza pandemic. And so they try to reanimate this doctor, and he is reanimated. The doctor kind of goes berserk, and he starts rampaging through the town as this kind of zombie figure. So here's another quote, right? Through the fevered town had crept a curse, which some said was greater than the plague, and which some whispered was the embodied daemon soul of the plague itself. 8 houses were entered by a nameless thing, which strewed red death in its wake. In all, 17 maimed and shapeless remnants of bodies were left behind by the voiceless, sadistic monster that crept abroad. It had not left behind quite all that it had attacked, for sometimes it had been hungry. Right, so there is this sense of something that is that, I mean, he says very literally, right? This is an embodied plague, right? The demon soul of the plague itself. And we have 8 houses. He goes from house to house to house, and instead of spreading a cure, as doctors were supposed to do at the time, right? He spreads, as doctors did, right? He spreads death and blood, and it becomes sort of flesh eating here. And this is, you know, it's let me stop sharing. So this is terrifying, right? Absolutely, right? This is it seems sort of sensationalized, right? But it's terrifying. But in many ways, this was a kind of this was easier to encompass, right? So sometimes we take things that are terrifying and mysterious, and we can't put into words, and we can't like identify, and we turn it into a monster, and as a way of kind of visualizing it, right? And you can see that happening in this story, where this is horrifying, right? This is horrifying what's happening, but it's 8 houses, right? I mean, so we're talking about a death count that is, it's 17 people, right? So we're talking about a death count that's dramatically lower, right, than the pandemic, and producing some similar results, like wasting of the flesh and the bloodiness of it. But it's something that that is like the mind can encompass a little bit easier than an invisible virus, and so so you sort of you materialize a fear, and then what they try to do is they can try to contain this. They try to contain this fear, but they keep producing these different zombies, and eventually in the short story, it becomes very clear that that part of what he's suggesting is the way that metaphors of infection can start to turn into metaphors of prejudice, right? So that, and we see this happen with like the Nazis, where the sort of whole Jewish population became a kind of cancer, right, or a disease sort of on the country, right? And so this is where things get really, really dangerous, where Lovecraft starts to, in his case, his targets were recent immigrants, people of color, and he's also homophobic, right? So so that this sort of disease becomes like the disease that these disease metaphors start to be applied to these groups, right? These sort of different zombie groups, and things get very, very messy, and it doesn't end well for Herbert West. But it is so monsters are doing a lot of cultural work, I guess, right? Like that they're doing sometimes not in good ways, right? That they allow people to deal with very, very big, unwieldy emotions, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in very, very bad ways. But I think that this is, some of the impulse behind horror movies, right? To have things that we're scared of, but we watch it from a position of relative safety. So that's a lot. So that's Herbert West, and happy to talk about any of the other stories as well. That was the big one I talked
about. Yeah, if it's not too much to ask, could you talk about maybe one more of them? Because I can tell you, I can't speak for everyone else, but I was kind of enraptured, especially when you start, showing some of the short story there, and it's just, I don't know, it's just like I thought, wow, I could be reading that, could have been written in 2021, some of it, so.
Right. I mean, it starts to be really unsettling, and I think that this might be a good moment to bring in a kind of foil, and then I'll get back to the short story, but to understand this one short story, which is about a grave digger, right, who encounters a zombie. There's sort of these two popular culture threads that seem to come out of the pandemic and the war, and one is this, and they both concern resurrection. So one is this sort of zombies, right? So these are resurrected dead bodies, right, at a place, at a time where you could not see your loved one safely buried. There's all of this anxiety about, like, where are they, and are they angry, and will they come back, right? And all of those mourning rituals are interrupted, right? And so some of that energy goes into this zombie creation. But then there's this other track that is, there's this obsession after the war and after the influenza pandemic with spiritualism, right, which is sort of trying to contact the dead through seances, and there's this obsession with ectoplasm, which is supposed to be the sort of gooey connection between this world and the next, and ectoplasm can supposedly come in and form into the body of your loved one, or tap on the table, or play a musical instrument, or there's this craze of spirit photography. I can show you a picture of that, where let's see, where here's one where the ectoplasm comes from the medium's, like, nose or ears or eyes, and see, and forms itself into the shape. no, that's not what I wanted. Yep, there we are. Forms itself into the shape of the loved one, right? So this is ectoplasm coming from this medium's nose. I mean, it's not obviously, but, and you can see little faces in there. And supposedly the ectoplasm is forming into the faces. This central big face is actually supposedly I mean, it is, but it's probably a cutout picture, right? Of Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and he's very involved in the spiritualism movement. So this is not something that spiritualism actually begins in the United States in the mid 19th century. So it's also a way for people to handle a lot of the trauma of the Civil War, right? So it's not that it appears for the first time, or there's interest in seances and mediums and ectoplasm that it appears for the first time after the war and the influenza pandemic. But there's a huge, it was waning, and there's this huge surge in popularity. So people want to go to photographers and have pictures taken of themselves to see if their loved ones magically appear in the photographs behind them. They did, but the photos are clearly fraudulent. But it provided an enormous amount of comfort. And you have Arthur Conan Doyle, who invented Sherlock Holmes, and he's very involved in the spiritualism movement. He's obsessed with it, in fact. He is in the 1920s giving sold out, standing room only talks all across the United States. He's selling out Carnegie Hall, right? He's showing these spirit photographs. And he's talking about his own experiences, talking to his son. So it's often reported that Arthur Conan Doyle loses his son in World War I. But in fact, he doesn't. His son survives World War I. His son dies in the influenza pandemic. But and Arthur Conan Doyle is a doctor, right? He's a doctor by training, and he's not able to save his son. There was nothing you could do in the influenza pandemic to save someone. There's no cures. There was nothing. There was nothing available, and so there's a lot of doctors and a lot of scientists who get very, very involved in the spiritualism movement, and they want to prove scientifically that ectoplasm is real, and that seances are real, right? So they devise all of these scientific experiments. They're testing mediums. They uncover a bunch of fraud. But they also uncover things, right, that they feel like they can't explain. So this was this other movement, right, that was trying to think about resurrection in a different way. The Sorbonne is very seriously studying ectoplasm in the 1920s, right? You do a search for ectoplasm in the New York Times, 1920s, like it's all over the 1920s, right? People are obsessed. And it's the kind of thing that happens, right, when you have 100 million people die and you cannot bury them, and you have 10 million people die in World War I, and most of those people are not buried either, right? There are so many we're missing. And what do you do with all that grief? How does the mind encompass it, right? And I think that for those of us who've lost people in COVID, know a little bit about this, right? That there is not a place to say goodbye, right? There was not a burial, right? Or not a burial in the conventional sense, right? Not a funeral where you could be with other people, right? So all of the things that help us deal and process grief were not in place. And so what do you do as a culture? And spiritualism came around, and I make no comment on whether it's true or not, or whether there may be true mediums, or I just don't know. But the idea was that even if you couldn't save your patient, right? A lot of doctors got involved in spiritualism. You couldn't save your patient from the flu, but you could resurrect them, right? Or you could contact them, and they could tell you that they are okay, right? That they're okay in this next life, right? And this is enormously comforting. And Arthur Conan Doyle was, by all accounts, very genuine in his belief, right? He wasn't trying to fraud, he wasn't trying to trick anyone, right? He believed that he had been speaking to his son. And the amount of comfort that he was able to offer was immense, right? Where the dead sort of came back and said, "I'm okay. I'm just mainly worried about you, right? But I'm okay. I'm in a better place." Right. So this form of resurrection sort of met this other zombie form of resurrection. So Lovecraft hates this. He hates spiritualism. Houdini, the magician, he hates this as well. Right. And so they want to, and so they're very interested in debunking this. Right. So the zombies that Lovecraft creates are in some ways the kind of antithesis of these, this idea that the dead would come back with comfort for the living. Right. He's like, don't contact the dead. If you resurrect the dead, they'll come back angry and they'll want to eat you. And it's going to be horrible. So don't do it. Right. So these are these sort of two messages. And some appeal to some people and some appeal to the other, you know. I mean, I think different people responded differently, but it was ways for the culture to process very, very big emotions that they probably couldn't process in other ways. So this brings us to a Lovecraft story. What is another one? There's another one. I'm trying to remember offhand what is the name. It's amazing you can write about these things. It's in the vault, right? In the vault, and this is a story about a grave digger, right? And he's quite lazy, right? And the bodies. It's set before the pandemic, but it evokes the pandemic, the influenza pandemic, because there's all these bodies piling up, and he doesn't want to bury them because he doesn't want to build the coffins, and the ground's hard, and but he's not giving people proper burial, and he's very sloppy. He's putting bodies in the wrong coffin, and so one night he goes out and he gets caught in the vault. And so he's trying to dig himself out, right? He's basically underground with all these bodies, and he's trying to dig himself out. And as he's digging himself out, he feels this thing on his ankle, right? And it's a bite, right? It's one of these dead bodies, right? This come to life, and it bites him and severs the tendon, right? And so he crawls out of this vault that is kind of a grave, right, over the ground, right, and he's bleeding, and it's bloody, and the doctor comes, and the doctor goes out to survey the vault, and he sees what's happened. And what has happened is that previously the gravedigger had taken a body and cut it, right, cut the legs off in order to fit it in a coffin, right, to kind of cut corners. And so this unrestful dead, right, that had not been buried properly, surges up in anger and bites him, and then the gravedigger himself becomes this kind of zombie figure, right? He's so traumatized, and he can't go back to this work, and he ends in this terrible way, right? But there is this this way that it kind of helps process the anger that people felt towards, and there's so many accounts, right, of gravediggers, right, being overwhelmed and cutting corners, and there's all these mass graves, right, prepared in the pandemic, and this anger at not having a proper burial, right, for your loved one, and imagining that they would come back and kind of infect you and try to kind of eat your flesh, was another way of processing what seemed sort of unprocessable. Yeah, that's it. So that in general, Lovecraft, in addition to all of the sort of the groups that he that he dislikes, and I mean he's really deeply prejudicial in a range of ways. He also is channeling anger towards gravediggers as well as doctors, right? That those are the other two groups that come under his wrath. Yeah, so it's kind of like two versions of resurrection, one with good news and one with terrible news.
See, and I think I have a couple of questions here in the chat, and I think you sort of answered this first one. How much do you think the influenza virus affected Lovecraft's writing?
So I think it's always difficult to tell exactly, like, okay, well, what came from what, right? Anybody who's ever taken a literature class, right? That what is going through an author's mind, right, at a particular moment in time. So we kind of look at, it's difficult to assess. So we look at patterns, right, and we look at context and what was surrounding Lovecraft at the time, and what did Rhode Island look like, right, when he was writing it, and so we can see by comparing his stories to newspaper accounts, to gravedigger accounts, right, that were right outside his door. We can see that he is evoking a sensory and an emotional history that really resonates across like all of the flu accounts, right? So he's talking about all of the sights and smells and sounds and tastes, right, that came out of the pandemic sort of show up in these patterns in these short stories. So I think that literature is good at that, right? Literature is good at depicting a climate, right? Like what in 20 years is going to trigger us back to this moment? It's going to be like the sight of masks, right? It's going to be as I was saying before, like the smell of hand sanitizer. It's going to be whatever it is that you associate. Sometimes like just getting on Zoom, right, can bring us back to last year, right? So there's all these ways that that illness and pandemics get written into the kind of the atmosphere, what I call a sensory and emotional history. And so we see that showing up very, very clearly in Lovecraft's writing. So so I think, yes, it does really influence influence his writing in these deep ways. And it was something that, even if he's not sort of consciously aware of it, it's something that his readers really responded to. So Quinn, I see you have a question. So if I recall correctly, you say, I seem to remember a resurgence in zombie-related media in the early 2010s. Yes, could that have been connected to the fears over things like the Ebola epidemic, the spread of swine flu? And do you think we could see another resurgence in zombie-related media post-COVID? So I think it's possible. I think that in that sort of every decade needs its own zombie, right? If you like look at the Romero films, right, the Night of the Living Dead, the 1968 films, and some of the ones coming after that, their zombies. Zombies seemed to reflect in some of the films a kind of consumer culture, right, that had run rampant, right? It seemed to reflect maybe fears coming out of the Cold War, right, or nuclear arms, right, fears. It definitely, the Night of the Living Dead, right, has that he's one of the main characters in Night of the Living Dead is Black, and he is shot at the very end by this sort of posse of white policemen, right, who are coming up and just sort of shooting indiscriminately into the house, right? So also about sort of racism and how that's sort of coming into the culture. And the 1920s, I think that it can be, right, it can be Ebola, right? There's that's certainly possible. And it's also possible that it's a range of other things, right? A range of other things that's producing this surge of zombies. So sometimes you have the same monster but for different reasons, right? Because meaning changes over time, right? Even our own objects, right? The things that we have change over time, right? The symbol, like what it means to us, they change, and so zombies in the 2010s may be linked to a range of different things, right? A range of different meanings that allowed people to process things that were going on, right? Like what. And I think different shows, right? One of the things that I think is striking about the Walking Dead is that they really start to talk about how traumatic it is, right, to see people that you once loved, right, walking around as zombies, right? Like that this is a whole nother sort of attribute, right, to introduce, right? This is somebody that you know and you cared about and is no longer the person that you thought that they were. So this can be a trope for a range of things, and sometimes we can tell what it is that inspires the popularity of something, and sometimes we're just I mean, actually, we're always making guesses. But as to the 2010s, that is where I'm out of my area of expertise, right? But it's a great question, and I think it's worth asking. Like, what is it? And of course, the question's always going to be multiple, right? That it means like a really good monster will often mean multiple things. Right. So and different things to different people.
Let me ask, what's next for your work related to this topic?
Yeah, so I'm feeling like I'm honestly, after I finished before COVID, right? I had, right, like I had promised my family like that my next book would be on happiness, or something with a much lower death count. I don't. I always felt I needed a shower after I read Lovecraft, right? Like these are really heavy topics. So I want to not write on pandemics, and that was the plan. Obviously, because of COVID, I've been writing on nothing but pandemics and talking on nothing but pandemics since the book came out. And that's fine. But so next for me, honestly, I feel like it might just be something fictional, right? Maybe I can process the whole thing through my own short stories, but yeah, something with a lower body count, please. I think that's kind of what we need. Yeah, and be careful, right? Because be careful about binging just on tragedy, right? Be careful. I think there's a tendency for all of us to, I love this term, doom scroll, right? That you're doom scrolling, usually after midnight, right? You're sort of just going through the news and like looking for the worst things possible so you can kind of confirm why it is that you're so anxious and depressed, right? And I just caution you against that, because it's not a recipe for recovery or coming out of this, right? Modulate your diet of terror, horror, and terrible news, because it's very easy to binge on it, and there are things, there are good things that are happening, right? There are heroic things that are happening. It doesn't seem like it when you read the news, but there are people out there, right, risking their life every day, right? And doing great things, right? Great things in the world. And I think if you only consume a diet of this, you can become hopeless, and you can kind of think like, well, the world's burning anyway, so why does it matter? But I would urge you not to do that, right? Because there are things, we will come through this, and there's definitely ways to make things better. Right, and people are doing it. So yeah, don't gorge on bad news, because it will block your ability to make things better.
And let me ask, how did you first become interested? Like, what was the motivation that you said, I'm going to explore the connection between zombies and modern literature? I mean, how did that come about?
Yeah, right. Like I was really hoping. It was a colleague of mine who was very into zombies, and I'm not. I confess, I'm not a horror. I don't. Whatever filter most people have that can allow them to watch movies and not have it feel like it's actually happening, which of course, it's not. I don't have that filter, so I really do. I am really careful about what I watch, and zombies was not, so I was like, please don't tell me that zombies uh, um, are important, right? For the pandemic. But then, as I read Lovecraft and I investigated these movies, and I read a lot about zombies, and I watched all the zombie movies, and it seemed pretty clear to me that there was a 1920 strain that came out of it. But I came through the spiritualism side. I was at my doctor's office, and this is often how research ideas come to you. And I was reading an article that mentioned that after World War I and the pandemic, people got obsessed with seances and spiritualism. And I was like, okay, I've got to know more about that, right? Like I've got to know more. I need to know everything there is to know about that. That seemed fascinating to me. And very understandable, right? Why there would be a surge in that. And I love Sherlock Holmes. Any Sherlock fans out here? Yeah. And so I elementary. And I read all of Sherlock Holmes, and so that was the kind of rabbit hole that I went down, and then that led me, to these sort of different elements. It also led me to magic shows, which you wouldn't think, but the most popular magic trick of all time, like ever, is the sawing the woman in half trick. And this is a trick that comes in right after the war and the pandemic, right? And so if you think about the visual there, right, where you have this young, healthy woman, who was one of the most, the influenza pandemic, unlike COVID, killed young, healthy people your age in the highest numbers, right? It killed the very young, and it killed the very old. It killed the immune compromised, but it killed healthy young adults in incredibly high numbers, right? So the healthier you were, sometimes the more likely you were to die in the influenza pandemic. So you have this visual of this healthy young woman climbing into a coffin and being dismembered. Often they added blood, and it was sort of, grisly, right? And being disfigured in all the ways that the war and the pandemic disfigured bodies, and then magically put back together again, and then marched around the stage, right? Climbing out of the coffin, like resurrecting herself out of the coffin, and being whole and healthy once more, right? Not dirty, not bloody, but healthy and walking around, not in a coffin, right? So this is a very, very, very powerful visual, and it just storms all over the places it storms all over the world, right? It's the most popular magic trick of all time. But I didn't end up having room to talk about in the book. So that's kind of the joy of research, right? Is to kind of one thing leads to another thing, and then you're curious about something else. And I then started to read things that I had taught for years, like T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, or W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming, or work by Virginia Woolf, and that I hadn't seen through a flu lens. And then I started to do research, and all of them had this intimate connection to the flu. They all caught the flu. And you start to see that some of these big major works are in fact linked to their experiences in the flu. Yeah, so that's kind of how it happens. It sort of just builds, and you go in this direction, then you go in this direction, and you think, am I crazy? Right? And then you just kind of keep going. It's fun, but I'm glad I'm done with it. And I'm really glad I wasn't writing it during COVID. because I just too much, right? You may have noticed that it's extremely hard to concentrate right now, because our adrenaline levels are just like up here, right? And so I think that's why everyone's so exhausted, because it takes so much energy for us to concentrate on just sort of getting through the day, and that doesn't even account the amount of like loss and bodily harm the pandemic has done. So,
Well, everyone, we have just a couple of minutes left. Do any of you have any other questions for Dr. Outka? And if not, let me just ask this. I guess this can kind of be a sort of a final question. Since COVID has happened, and I know that you did this work before it, but has it brought a lot more light to your work? I mean, are you getting asked much more to talk about this? I mean, and are you okay with that as far as, and I hope you are, since I asked you to come talk about it.
Yeah, it has been a little overwhelming. I'm not somebody who I'm very introverted, right? So it's been overwhelming, and it's been we all want our work to have attention, but maybe not this much. But to the so I've been doing a lot of talks and essays and things, but to the extent that this work is comforting, right? To the extent that that the literature, especially, I mean, I'm an English professor, so mainly I'm not doing zombie stuff, right? I'm doing sort of the literature, but I feel like the literature was enormously comforting to me, to read something like The Wasteland or The Second Coming or Mrs. Dalloway, right? And to see our own experiences mirrored there, to see the Catherine Ann Porter has this great sort of novella called Pale Horse, Pale Rider. She catches the flu, and it's about the war and the flu. And it's about that where we were in March, right, of 2020, where every day this new reality, like you think, okay, right, I got it, right, I think I've adjusted to this reality, and then things flip, right, and then things flip again, right, and then things flip again, right, and that sort of vertigo of like you don't know where you are in the story or what's going on, like to the extent that prepared me for the fact that that part of really surviving this was to know that your paradigms were going to change really rapidly, and that you needed to kind of adjust to that as quickly as you could. And so to the extent that the literature has provided some representation and some comfort in seeing our own experiences mirrored, that makes it worth sort of going out and doing talks, because I think we have a lot to process. Right. So, yeah, yes, right. Like early 2020 was a year and late 2020 was a decade, right? And that's one thing that comes up everywhere in the modernist literature that I teach is time, right? Time got weird, right? It's still weird, right? Every day is like a marathon, right? And yet it feels like 2020 didn't happen, right? And then it also feels like 2020 lasted a decade, right? And it's like our and the literature that I teach is all about that, right? It's all about the way that traumas of various kinds mess with our sense of time, and how re-narrating a story, right? Putting it back in time is sort of part of the way that we process things, and part of how we recover. Is to try to make it into a narrative, right, that we can read and that we can understand. But we're not ready to do that because we don't know where we are in the story. But I think I just would urge you towards, urge you towards art, right? Whatever it is that works for you. And that doesn't mean binge watching horror, right? But like music and painting, right? And sculpture and literature and movies, right? That can help all of us, right? Process what has been an unbelievably difficult year, right? And that's, right, because it has been a year not just of COVID, right, but of George Floyd, right, and Breonna Taylor, and countless others, right, that that we need to keep naming, and that and protests, right, that were inspiring, and disheartening that we had to have them, right, and just like it's been I mean, it's a lot, right? So so turn to art, right? Turn to art, and a good therapist, right? To help you process some of the things that have been going on, and be kind to yourself. Really, like self-care. It's really true, right? Really, Skittles and Red Bull are not a food group. You know, try to remember that. You need sleep, you need protein, and so yeah, take good care of yourself, and use art to help yourself heal.
And since we're pretty much at time, let's let Logan's chat question be the last one here. Do you think things will go back to the way they were pre-COVID, or will some things just won't ever change?
Look, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can put plans in place. We historically, as humans, have very short attention spans, and that we're all for pandemic preparedness when we're in the midst of a pandemic, and then as soon as the pandemic is over, we're not, right? So fighting for policies. And I used to live in Tennessee, right? So I have a lot of friends still in Tennessee. So I mean, fighting for policies that are fighting for public health, right? Fighting for good health policies. There is no rule that says that you can only get one deadly pandemic a century, right? And remember, right, you know, people forget, like there's like AIDS, HIV, which is still a pandemic that is raging, right? And so we have the ability to stop pandemics, but we have to devote the resources for them. So I think it's going to be a question of, can we do it? Are we willing to put the money up? Are we willing to make the changes that are going to be required? So I don't think any of us will ever be the same, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we will make better choices in the future. But I'm hopeful. Look, I'm hopeful that we can turn around our planet burning up, right? I'm hopeful that we can make better, that we can sort of make, that we can curtail some of the oppression and discrimination, right? That we've and that we can respond better to pandemics. I'm hopeful because we have the technology, right? We have the knowledge, we can do it. It's going to require everyone voting, right? It's going to require everyone fighting. But things get better, right? Things can get better, right? Things, 100 years ago, right? I'm not a professor, right? I'm not a professor. I'm not even able to go to the college I went to. Right, so some things change, but obviously sometimes change is slow. But I think that we have changed in the past. We can change in the future, and we can fight for that change.
All right. Well, we will conclude on that note of hopefulness. Then,
hopeful. Yeah.
I really appreciate everyone taking part, everyone joining in on the conversation tonight, and a extra special thanks to you, Dr. Outka, for a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it.
You bet. And thank you all for coming. It was you all asked great questions, and I know that there's a lot on your plate right now. So so thanks and good luck.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye bye.